The cold was the first thing to greet Cole Hart, a familiar and unwelcome companion in the hour before dawn. It crept through the chinks in the log walls of his small cabin, a persistent whisper of the coming winter in the high country of the Colorado Territory. The year was 1887, and Redemption Ridge was a place that offered little of its namesake. It was a long, dry valley gouged between unforgiving peaks, a land of thin soil and thick dust where the wind was the only constant farmer, sowing grit in every corner. The silver mines that had given the valley its hopeful name were mostly played out, leaving behind skeletal head frames and bitter men who now eyed the cattle ranches with a covetous squint. The railroad was coming, a promise of progress that felt more like a threat, its iron veins destined to carve up the open range. Cole swung his legs out of the bunk, the rough woolen blanket scratching against his skin. He was a man just past 30, built of long muscle and quiet habits. Solitude had settled on him like a second skin here in Hart's Hollow. The ranch his father had carved out of nothing and left for him and his brother. Now it was just his. He moved with an economy of motion, dressing in the dark, his fingers finding the worn denim and flannel without thought. As he pulled on his shirt, his left shoulder twinged, an old song sung by the scar tissue beneath, a reminder of rustlers and a night that had cost him more than just blood. That night, and the legal sham that followed, was why he kept his distance from the town of Redemption Ridge, finding better company in his herd and the vast, empty sky. Outside, the air was sharp with the clean, alkaline smell of soda dust. The moon was a pale sliver in a sky beginning to bruise with morning. The only sounds were the creak of his own boot heels on the porch boards and the soft nicker of his horse from the corral. The slow, deliberate rhythm of his morning chores was a bulwark against the loneliness. He measured out feed, his breath pluming white. He checked the water trough, breaking a thin scrim of ice with his gloved hand. The world was stark and simple. The grasslands, stretching out before him, were scorched to the color of old straw, crisscrossed by the dark, meandering lines of dry arroyos. Far to the west, the mountain peaks held on to the last of the winter's snow, a jagged white crown against the growing light. He saw his cattle, small specks of red and white and black, grazing near the cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. From a distant ridge, the long, mournful howl of a wolf drifted on the wind. Nature was not a backdrop here, it was a presence, a formidable character in the daily drama of survival, and Cole understood its language better than he did the guarded pleasantries of men. He was saddling his horse, the scent of worn leather and horse sweat filling the air, when he heard it, a sound that did not belong, the rhythmic rattle and jolt of a coach, moving too fast along the rutted track that led from town. He straightened up, his hand resting on the saddle horn. His eyes narrowed toward the plume of dust rising in the east. The mail coach passed by twice a week, and this was not the day. It never stopped here. Never. Yet it was stopping. The driver pulled the team to a rough halt 100 yards from his cabin, the horses stamping and blowing in the cold. Cole remained where he was, a statue of wary stillness. He watched as the driver, a stout man named Miller, climbed down from his perch and opened the coach door. A figure emerged, small and hesitant, a woman. She stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, clutching a worn carpet bag. Miller gestured in Cole's direction, said something brief, and then, with a haste that seemed almost panicked, climbed back aboard. The whip cracked, and the coach lurched away, leaving the woman standing alone in a swirl of dust. Cole did not move. He watched her for a long moment as the sound of the coach faded. She was slender, dressed in a dark traveling suit that was ill-suited for the rugged landscape. She looked fragile against the immense backdrop of the valley. After a moment of hesitation, she began walking toward him, her steps measured, her back straight. As she drew closer, he could see she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with a pale face and large, serious eyes that were fixed on him. There was a quiet determination in her posture that belied her delicate frame. She stopped a respectable distance from him, her hands clasped around the handle of her bag. She said her name was Mara Ellison. She told him she had come in response to his letter. Cole's mind went blank. He stared at her, the words failing to connect with any reality he knew. He had written no letter. He had not corresponded with anyone but the Cattlemen's Association in months, and certainly not with a woman. He lived a solitary life by choice, nursing a deep mistrust of promises and people. The idea of him seeking a wife through the mail was so foreign, so utterly impossible, it was almost laughable. But the woman standing before him was not laughing. He finally found his voice, and it was rougher than he intended. He told her she must be mistaken. He said there was no letter. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She opened her handbag and drew out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to him. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady. He took a reluctant step forward and accepted the letter. The paper was of good quality, better than anything he kept in his cabin. He unfolded it. The words were a shock, a violation. They spoke of a shared future, of building a life together in Heart's Hollow. They described the ranch with an accuracy that was unnerving, mentioning the stand of aspens near the spring and the view of the snow-capped peaks from the porch. They were written in a confident, flowing hand, and at the bottom, in a passable imitation of his own blocky script, was his name. Cole Hart. Anger, cold and sharp, cut through his confusion. He looked from the signature to the woman's expectant face. He felt a surge of fury at the unknown person who had played this cruel trick, who had used his name and his home to lure this woman across the country. He looked at the postmark, Redemption Ridge. The letter had been mailed from the town he so carefully avoided. He told her plainly that he did not write this. He said it was a forgery. The color drained from her face, leaving it ashen. She looked at the letter in his hand, then back at him, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. She insisted it must be him. The directions were perfect. The name was his. The promise was clear. As they stood there, locked in a standoff of disbelief and denial, the world around them began to change. The wind, which had been a steady breeze, picked up a sudden, malevolent force. It whipped dust from the ground, stinging their faces. The sky in the west, once a clear, pale blue, was turning a bruised, dirty brown. A low hum filled the air, the sound of a million tiny grains of sand being roused for an assault. Cole knew the signs. An early-season duster, a rolling wall of earth and wind that could strip paint from a barn and a man of his senses. He glanced at the road back to town, already seeing it blur and disappear behind the advancing haze. There was no outrunning it. To be caught in the open would be suicide. The situation was no longer a simple matter of a mistake. It was a matter of survival. He could not, in good conscience, send her away to face that storm. The injustice of his position was galling. He was being forced to shelter a stranger, a living embodiment of a lie that had been pinned to his name. The unfairness of it tasted like the legal poison he had swallowed a year ago, when Sheriff Deeks had looked right through his evidence and sided with a man of influence. He made a decision, his voice tight with resentment. He told her she could not go back to town. He said she would have to wait out the storm here. He led her not to his cabin, but to the barn. The wind was howling now, tearing at their clothes. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the familiar smells of hay and animals. He pointed to a large, clean stall, its floor thick with fresh straw. He told her she could stay there. It was dry and out of the wind. Then he gestured back toward the small cabin. He explained that the kitchen was warm, and she could use the stove and the hearth, but his meaning was clear. An invisible line drawn between the two of them. He would offer sanctuary from the storm, but nothing more. His honor, and hers, demanded a strict separation. He was a man who lived by a rigid code, and the presence of this woman, a victim of some cruel prank, would not make him compromise it. As the first heavy gusts of sand began to batter the barn walls, making the timbers groan, the weight of their predicament settled in. A lie had brought them together, A storm had trapped them. For Cole, it was a bitter test of his principles. For Mara, it was a terrifying unknown. The world had shrunk to this small, protected space, and they were two strangers bound by a fiction, forced to trust each other for the barest necessity of safety. The town of Redemption Ridge, with its gossip and its compromised lawmen, Sheriff Deeks, and its saloon owner, Silas Vane, felt a world away, yet the tendrils of its malice had reached all the way out here. Cole knew how a place like that would treat a woman arriving as a mail-order bride, especially one attached to a scandal. Malice was a crop that grew well in that thin soil. Later, as the storm raged outside, a relentless scraping and roaring that blotted out the world, Cole allowed her into the cabin's main room, which served as his kitchen and living space. It was too cold in the barn. He sat at his rough-hewn table, cleaning a rifle, the rhythmic scrape of the oilcloth a counterpoint to the wind's fury. She sat near the stone hearth, the firelight catching the tired lines on her face. She held the forged letter in her hands, turning it over and over. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Then, in the flickering light of the oil lamp, her posture changed. She leaned closer to the flame, tilting the paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. She said there was something on the paper, something she had not seen before, a mark. Cole stopped his work and looked over. She held the letter up so the light shone through it. Embedded in the fibers of the expensive paper was a faint, almost invisible image, a watermark. It depicted a simple hammer and a pickaxe. Crossed. She said she recognized it. She had seen it on the invoices at the mercantile where she bought her train ticket. It was the mark of Tanner's Goods, the main supply store in Redemption Ridge. The information landed with the force of a physical blow. The forger was not some distant, anonymous trickster. It was someone in town, someone who knew him, who knew his ranch, who had walked into the local store and bought the very paper that now held this young woman's hopes in its false promises. The enemy was not a phantom. He was close, very close. The discovery of the watermark hung in the air between them, a small, damning fact in the roaring chaos of the storm. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a physical force that seemed intent on tearing the small structure from its foundations. Sand and grit rattled against the single glass window pane like a spray of buckshot. For 2 days, the world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the shrieking brown darkness outside. Cole had laid out a spare bedroll for himself by the door, ceding the relative warmth of the hearth to Mara. He had laid down the rules without ceremony. She was to have her privacy, and he his. There would be no misunderstanding, no cause for the kind of gossip that could ruin a woman in a town like Redemption Ridge. He was offering shelter, not welcome. Yet, a subtle shift was occurring, a change as undeniable as the barometric pressure. It began in the kitchen, on the first morning of their confinement. Cole had risen in the pre-dawn gloom to find Mara already awake. She had not lit the main lamp, but had coaxed the embers in the hearth back to life, her slight figure silhouetted against the soft, pulsing glow. He watched her from the shadows, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent, wary observer. She moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. She found his sack of pinto beans, the slab of salt beef hanging from a rafter, the tin of coffee. There was no hesitation in her movements, no wasted gestures. She seemed to feel his eyes on her and looked up. The firelight softened the tired lines around her eyes. She asked him if he was always this quiet. The question was direct, without artifice. He considered it for a moment, the sound of the wind filling the silence. He answered that he only said what needed saying. The wind handled the rest. A small smile touched her lips, a brief and surprising flicker of light in the gloom. She accepted his answer with a nod and turned back to her work. Soon, the cabin was filled with the rich, comforting aromas of brewing coffee and simmering beans. Smells that pushed back against the sterile scent of dust that had infiltrated every crack. She found a skillet and sliced off pieces of the beef, frying them until they sizzled. When the food was ready, she served it onto 2 tin plates without a word and set them on the rough table. As Cole ate, he found himself watching her. The gratitude he felt was an uncomfortable sensation, something he had not had cause to feel in a long time. It sat alongside his suspicion, a confusing mix of emotions. He ate the food she had prepared in his home, using his provisions. Yet he felt like the guest over that meal. As the storm raged, she told him a little of her story. Her words were spare, chosen with care. She was an orphan, she explained, who had worked since she was old enough to scrub a floor. Her last position had been as a kitchen assistant in a boarding house back east. The proprietor had been a man of some local importance, a man with a wife and children and a wandering eye. His attentions had become persistent, his suggestions less and less veiled. Mara had seen what happened to other girls in her position, how they were used and then discarded, their reputations left in tatters. She had saved every spare penny, and when the man's advances became a threat, she could no longer ignore. She had fled. The letter, arriving from a distant place called Colorado, had been more than a proposal of marriage. It had been a lifeline, a chance at an honorable existence, a life where she would not be at the mercy of powerful men. Cole listened without interruption, his face giving nothing away. But her story resonated with his own deep-seated mistrust of those who wielded power without principle. When she finished, his gaze drifted to a small wooden box that sat on the mantelpiece above the hearth. It was made of dark, polished cedar, bound with brass fittings, and secured with a small, sturdy lock. He kept the key on a leather thong around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. The box held the few remaining fragments of his past daguerreotype of his parents, his mother's wedding band, and the last pay voucher his older brother, Daniel, had ever earned. Daniel had been killed during a cattle raid 2 years prior, ambushed and shot down. The rustlers had made it look as though Daniel himself was one of them, and Sheriff Deeks, eager to close the case, had accepted the flimsy evidence. He had labeled a dead Hart boy a thief, tarnishing the family name and leaving a wound in Cole that had never healed. The box was a repository of that memory, a constant, silent testament to a justice denied. It was the reason he avoided crowds and put his faith in the unforgiving but honest laws of nature rather than the corrupted laws of men. His first instinct, his deepest impulse, was still to get this woman to town as soon as the storm broke and sever all connection to her. She was trouble, a piece of someone else's vicious game that had landed on his doorstep. But the storm gave him no choice, and her quiet resilience, the steadfast look in her eyes, gave him pause. There was a strength in her that the lie had not broken. The storm confined them, but the demands of the ranch were relentless. On the second day, during a brief lull when the wind eased its assault, Cole went out to check on his livestock. He found a newborn calf shivering in a corner of the barn, its breathing shallow and ragged. Pneumonia. He carried the small animal into the cabin and laid it on a blanket by the fire. Mara was there instantly, her voice soft as she examined the calf. She heated water and began to gently clean the animal's muzzle. Cole prepared a drench of whiskey and herbs, a remedy his father had taught him. To administer it, he needed another pair of hands. He showed Mara how to hold the calf's head, how to keep it steady. She did so without flinching, her touch firm but gentle. They worked together in silence, a temporary team forged by the needs of a helpless creature. The shared, practical task created a different kind of intimacy, one built on capability and mutual effort, not words. Later, when the calf was sleeping peacefully by the fire, they went out into the stinging wind to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a falling branch. The cold was biting, and the work was hard. They stretched the wire taut, their gloved hands working in unison to staple it to the posts. In the face of nature's harshness, their individual troubles seemed to shrink. They were simply two people fighting to hold a small piece of the world together. Back in the cabin that evening, the air was warmer, the silence less heavy. As Mara cleaned the glass chimney of the oil lamp, her brow furrowed. She picked up the letter again, which lay on the table. She pointed to the signature, to a small, brownish discoloration near the ink. It was a faint smudge, almost a shadow. She remarked that it looked as if a drop of tea had stained the paper while the ink was still wet. Cole looked at the mark. Tea was not something he drank, but he knew that in the back rooms of Silas Vane's saloon. The girls who worked there often passed the slow afternoon hours drinking tea while they waited for the evening rush. It was a small detail, another slender thread leading back to the same place. Each evening, after their simple meal, Mara would light that single oil lamp and place it in the center of the table, in the deep, oppressive darkness of the cabin, a space that had known only solitude for so long. The small, steady flame was a defiant point of light. It became a silent ritual, a symbol of her presence. It was a beacon of hope in a place that had forgotten what hope looked like. A small flame holding back the vast, encroaching darkness of the wilderness and the darker wilderness in Cole's own heart. The slow, steady rhythm of their forced cohabitation was changing him, eroding the walls he had so carefully built. The emotions churning within him were not flowery or romantic. They were as rugged and unadorned as the landscape itself, a grudging respect growing from shared work, a flicker of warmth sparked by a quiet, shared existence. On the morning of the third day, they awoke to a profound silence. The wind had finally died. Cole opened the cabin door to a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the air was washed clean, carrying the scent of damp earth. The landscape, scoured by the storm, seemed new and raw. The period of sanctuary was over. The lie and the trouble it had brought was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. Cole watched as Mara stood on the porch, looking out at the clean-swept valley. He could send her away now. He could give her provisions, point her toward the road, and wash his hands of the whole affair. It would be the simplest, safest thing to do. But as he looked at her, at the proud set of her shoulders and the quiet dignity that had weathered both a cruel deception and a brutal storm, he knew he could not. The injustice done to her had become entangled with the old injustice that festered in his own soul. To turn her away would be a betrayal of some code he had not realized he still lived by. He made his decision. He walked over to stand beside her. The sun was warm on his face. He told her to gather her things. He was taking her to town. She turned to him, her eyes questioning. He met her gaze, his own clear and resolved. He said that if someone had started this with a lie, they would end it with the truth. The ride to Redemption Ridge was a journey from one world into another. Behind them, Heart's Hollow lay clean and stark, a landscape of honest, elemental truths. Ahead, the town simmered in a haze of its own making. The main street was a wide gash of red dust, churned to a fine powder by the passage of countless hooves and wagon wheels. The air, which had been crisp and clean in the valley, was thick here with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the sharp, sweet smell of whiskey drifting from the saloon doors, and the sweat of men, gaggles of railroad surveyors and laborers. New arrivals with hungry eyes loitered on the boardwalks, their loud talk a discordant note in the town's usual rhythm. Cole rode his steady buckskin, while Mara sat a gentle mare from his remuda. He had insisted she ride, not wanting her to arrive on foot like a vagrant. As they moved down the street, he was acutely aware of the eyes that followed them. He was a rare sight in town, and his arrival with an unknown woman was an event. Men paused their conversations to stare, but it was the women's gazes that were the most potent. From behind curtained windows and on the porches of the respectable houses, they watched Mara with a mixture of pity and sharp-edged censure. She was a woman alone with a man she was not married to, a mail-order bride in all but fact, and in their eyes, that placed her on a precarious social ledge, one strong gust of gossip away from a fatal fall. Mara kept her head high, her back straight in the saddle, but Cole could see the tension in the set of her jaw. Their first stop was Tanner's Goods, a long, low building crowded with everything from flour sacks to firearms. A small bell above the door announced their entry. The interior smelled of coffee beans, new leather, and oiled wool. A woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression looked up from behind the counter. This was Martha Tanner, a woman who knew every transaction and bit of news that passed through her store. Cole removed his hat. He greeted her, his voice low. Mrs. Tanner's eyes flickered from him to Mara and back again, her gaze sharp and inquisitive. He got straight to the point, placing the forged letter on the counter, careful to keep his hand over the writing. He asked her if she recognized the paper. She picked it up, her practical fingers testing its weight. She held it to the light, her eyes narrowing as she saw the watermark. She said of course she did. It was her best linen stock, imported from St. Louis. Expensive. Not the sort of thing a cowboy usually bought to write home. Cole pressed gently, asking if she recalled who might have purchased some recently. He knew it was a long shot. But Mrs. Tanner's memory was a finely tuned instrument. She pursed her lips, thinking. She said yes, she did remember a sale. About 2 weeks back, a man had come in, bought a whole packet of it, along with a new pen nib and a bottle of her best black ink. She had thought it was peculiar. Cole asked if she remembered the man. Her description was precise. He was not a rancher. She said his hands were too smooth. He was well-spoken, and his penmanship, when he tested the nib on a scrap of paper, was very fine and practiced. He had also left a large tip for her trouble, which was unusual. But the thing she remembered most, she added, wrinkling her nose, was the scent he carried. A cheap, cloying floral water, the kind the girls over at Silas Vane's saloon favored. The name landed in the quiet store like a stone. Silas Vane. Cole felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He thanked Mrs. Tanner for her time, folded the letter, and placed it back in his pocket. As they turned to leave, Mrs. Tanner's voice, now softened with a hint of something like concern, stopped them. She told Mara that this was a hard country for a woman alone. Cole simply nodded and led Mara back out into the dusty street. They had not taken 10 steps on the boardwalk when a voice, thick with false authority, called out Cole's name. Sheriff Deeks was leaning against a support post of the hotel porch, a toothpick jutting from the corner of his mouth. He was a large man, gone to soft in the middle, his face perpetually florid. He pushed himself off the post and ambled toward them, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. His eyes slid over Mara in a slow, appraising way that made Cole's hand itch. Deeks grinned, a humorless stretching of his lips. He said he had not figured Cole Hart for the marrying kind. Then his eyes hardened. He looked directly at Cole, his voice dropping to a low, suggestive tone. He said a single cowboy, living way out in a hollow, is seldom an innocent one. It was not a question. It was a pronouncement, a public branding. It was a clear and deliberate attempt to cast Cole as a villain and Mara as his victim, to poison the well of public opinion before they had even spoken a word in their own defense. The social pressure was immense, a tangible thing pressing in on them from all sides. Cole's voice was dangerously quiet when he replied. He said he was just in town on business. Sheriff, he put a slight emphasis on the title, a subtle jab at the man's unearned authority. Before Deeks could retort, the batwing doors of the saloon swung open, and Silas Vane himself stepped out. He was the physical opposite of the sheriff. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair slicked back. He moved with a practiced, predatory grace. A smile played on his lips, but it never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He ignored Cole completely, His entire attention focused on Mara. He swept off his hat in a gesture of mock chivalry. He said good morning. "Miss, it is not often our humble town is graced by such a lovely new face." He introduced himself as the proprietor of the establishment, a place of entertainment and comfort. Cole instinctively shifted his position, placing himself slightly between Silas and Mara. The air crackled with unspoken hostility. The conflict was no longer a matter of rumor and suspicion. It was here, raw and exposed, in the middle of the main street. Silas's smile widened. He told Mara that he had heard of her unfortunate predicament. News traveled fast in a small town. He said that if she should find herself in need of a place to stay, and a respectable, safe position, he could certainly provide one for her. His offer of a safe job was laden with a meaning so foul it seemed to poison the air around them. It was a public and humiliating insult, a proposal that she trade her honor for his protection. Cole's body went rigid, but before he could speak, Mara's voice, clear and steady, cut through the tension. She looked directly into Silas Vane's eyes, her own gaze unflinching. She said, "Thank you for the offer, sir, but I came to Redemption Ridge to be an honorable wife, not merchandise to be bought and sold." Her words were a slap in the face, a public rejection of his power and his insinuations. A flicker of genuine anger crossed Silas's face before he masked it with another slick smile. Deeks chuckled under his breath. The standoff was broken by a new voice, a woman's voice, sharp and intelligent. It was Dr. Nora Pike. She was coming out of the assayer's office, a leather medical bag in her hand. Dr. Pike was a widow in her 40s, a woman of formidable courage and intellect, who had earned the town's respect through her skill and her unwavering integrity. She walked directly toward them, her movements brisk and purposeful. She nodded a curt greeting to Cole, then turned a cool, dismissive gaze on Silas and the sheriff. She placed a reassuring hand on Mara's arm. She said, "It appears you have made some interesting acquaintances, my dear." Nora then turned to Cole. She said she was on her way to check on a sick child out near the fork in the road. It was on his way back to his ranch. She suggested they ride together. It was not a request. It was a strategic maneuver, a public declaration of her allegiance that instantly provided Mara and Cole with a shield of respectability. Silas Vane tipped his hat again, his smile now strained, and retreated back into the shadows of his saloon. Deeks, seeing his audience and his entertainment gone, spat his toothpick into the dust and sauntered off. As they rode out of town, Nora Pike wasted no time. She confirmed what Mrs. Tanner had hinted at. Silas Vane had been courting the railroad men for months. She said there were rumors of a secret contract. The railroad needed immense amounts of water for their steam engines, and the creek that ran through Redemption Ridge was unreliable, often running dry in the summer. But the old maps, she explained, showed a significant aquifer, a permanent source of underground water, located directly beneath Hart's Hollow. That water was more valuable than any silver left in the mountains. Silas wanted to tarnish Cole's name, create a scandal, and use the compromised sheriff to force him to sell his land cheap. The forged letter, the mail-order bride. It was all a cruel and elaborate tool to achieve that end. Then Nora provided them with another, more concrete piece of evidence. She said she had been called to the saloon a week ago to stitch up a cut on Silas's arm. He had been in a card game that had turned ugly. While she was cleaning the wound, she had noticed a distinct black ink stain on the cuff of his right shirt sleeve. He was left-handed, she added, and often careless with his pen. The pieces all fit, the expensive paper, the skilled left hand, the cheap perfume, the tea stain, the ink on his cuff, the motive. The web of deceit was becoming clear as the town fell behind them, replaced by the open, honest landscape of the valley. Cole felt a profound shift within him. The whirlwind of rumor, accusation, and innuendo in town had been suffocating. Out here, the truth seemed simpler. He looked over at Mara, riding beside him. She had faced down the town's most powerful and corrupt men with a quiet courage that humbled him. She had not buckled, had not wept. She had stood her ground. He had promised to take her back to the ranch to wait for proof. But as he rode, the wind clean on his face, he knew it was no longer just about waiting for evidence. In the space of a single, brutal morning, he had seen her character tested by fire, and she had emerged not just unscathed, but stronger. His promise to shelter her was no longer a grudging obligation. It was a choice. And looking at her, he realized, with a certainty that startled him, that he believed her. He believed in her. The belief that had taken root in Cole on the ride from town was a fragile thing, like the first green shoots after a long winter, vulnerable to the harsh realities of the land. And that reality, in the weeks that followed, was a relentless, punishing drought. The sun rose each day not as a source of life, but as a brassy, malevolent eye in a bleached sky. The creek that bisected Hart's Hollow, the lifeblood of the ranch, slowed to a trickle and then vanished, leaving behind a cracked, sun-baked scar of mud and whitened stones. The grasses in the pasture cured on the stalk, turning from gold to a brittle, lifeless brown. The cattle suffered. They drifted listlessly, their ribs beginning to show, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. Their search for water became a desperate, daily obsession. Cole, along with his young ranch hand, Jesse, spent their days riding the fence lines, their faces chapped by the hot, dusty wind, their eyes gritty and sore. Jesse was a wiry youth of 18, with a shock of sandy hair and a quiet loyalty that Cole valued more than words. He had come to the ranch a year ago, an orphan looking for work, and had grown into a capable hand. Mara worked alongside them, her quiet determination a steadying presence. She had taken over the cabin with a silent efficiency that had transformed it. The newborn calf, which she had named Patches, was now thriving under her care. She learned to mend the tough denim of their work clothes, to anticipate their needs, her presence weaving itself into the fabric of their daily existence. But a shadow hung over them, the unspoken threat of Silas Vane and the unresolved matter of the letter. The drought, however, was a more immediate and unforgiving enemy. It was Jesse who saw it first. He had ridden to the southern ridge to check on a stray, and he came back at a full gallop, his young face pale beneath its layer of dust. He did not need to shout. The evidence was in the sky behind him, a smudge of dirty brown smoke on the horizon, growing and darkening with an unnatural speed. A prairie fire. Cole's reaction was instantaneous. He swore once, a low, sharp word that cut through the afternoon's oppressive heat. He looked at the direction of the wind, a dry, steady breeze from the south, pushing the smoke directly toward them. He knew how fast a fire could move across this tinder, dry grass. They had an hour, maybe two. There was no panic, only a grim, focused urgency. Survival in this country was a matter of knowledge and swift, decisive action. He barked out orders. Jesse was to ride to the herd and begin driving them north, toward the wide, rocky expanse of the creek bed, which would serve as a natural fire break. Cole ran to the barn, grabbing shovels, heavy burlap sacks, and the barrels of water they kept for just such an emergency. Mara appeared at his side, her face set, her eyes wide but clear. She asked what she needed to do. For a moment, Cole considered ordering her to stay in the cabin, to seek shelter in the root cellar, but he saw the look in her eyes, the same resolute strength she had shown in town, and knew she would not be set aside. He needed every hand he could get. He told her they were going to fight it. They were going to start a backfire. He explained the principle quickly. They would burn a wide strip of grass in front of the main fire. When the big blaze arrived, it would meet the blackened, burned-out earth and, having no fuel, would die. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. If the wind shifted, their own fire could turn on them. They worked with a frantic, coordinated rhythm. They soaked the burlap sacks in water and raced to a position a half-mile south of the cabin. The smoke was thicker now, acrid in their throats, and a low, ominous roar, like a distant freight train, was beginning to vibrate through the soles of their boots. Cole used a lit torch to touch a line of dry grass. The flames erupted with a hungry whoosh, instantly leaping and spreading. It was terrifying, controlled chaos. Cole and Mara moved along the line of their own fire, he with a shovel, she with a wet, heavy sack, beating back any flames that tried to jump north. Toward the ranch. The heat was immense, a physical wall that seared their lungs. Smoke billowed around them, stinging their eyes and reducing visibility to a few feet. They were two small figures battling a monster of their own creation to defeat an even greater one. Mara did not falter. She swung the heavy sack with a strength he would not have believed she possessed. Her face smudged with soot, her jaw set in grim determination. The main fire was upon them now, a roaring, 50-foot wall of orange and black, devouring the prairie. The sound was deafening. The air crackled with heat and embers. Panicked animals, rabbits and coyotes, fled past them, their fear of man forgotten in the face of the greater terror. The cattle were a moving tide of brown and white in the distance. Jesse, a small, heroic figure driving them toward safety. Then, disaster within disaster. A small group of cows, separated from the main herd in the smoky confusion, broke back and tried to charge through the fence line. One of their calves, terrified and clumsy, got its leg caught fast in the barbed wire. Its bawling was a thin, piercing cry of agony against the roar of the fire. Mara saw it first. Without a thought, she dropped her sack and ran toward the trapped animal. Cole yelled her name, a word swallowed by the inferno, but she did not hear. The fire was closing in, 100 yards away and moving as fast as a running horse. Cole did not hesitate. He sprinted after her, his heart pounding with a cold. Primal fear he had not felt since the night his brother had died. He reached her as she was struggling with the wire, her bare hands trying to pull the barbs from the calf's panicked, thrashing leg. He grabbed her, shouting over the roar that it was too late, that they had to go. She looked at him, her face a mask of soot and desperation, and screamed that she would not leave it. In that instant, a gust of superheated wind drove a wave of embers over them. Cole acted on pure instinct. He shoved Mara to the ground, covering her body with his own, pressing her face into the dirt as the wave of fire washed over them. The heat was a physical blow, a stunning, brutal force. He felt the back of his shirt smolder, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his left arm. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The main fire front hit their backburn, found no fuel, and began to die down into a smoldering, black wasteland. The immediate, deafening roar was replaced by the crackle and pop of cooling embers. Cole pushed himself up, his arm throbbing. Mara coughed, struggling for air in the thick, choking smoke. He helped her to her feet. They were both alive, singed and shaken. The calf, miraculously, had been freed by the fire burning through the wooden fence post. It was gone, hopefully following its mother. They stumbled back toward the cabin, an island of green in a sea of black, charred earth. Mara looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and gratitude. She put a hand on his chest to steady herself and grunted, "You are as heavy as a bull." Cole managed a grimace, catching his breath. "I am usually a lightweight. The fire made me heavy." The flicker of humor, however strained, broke the terrible tension. Back at the cabin, the aftermath was a scene of desolate silence. The world was black and gray, covered in a fine layer of ash. The smell of smoke would linger for days. Jesse returned with the herd, safe and accounted for. He looked at Cole's arm, a raw, angry burn from his wrist to his elbow, and his young face was tight with worry. Mara, her hands trembling slightly, insisted on cleaning and bandaging the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. Later, as twilight fell, casting long purple shadows across the blackened land. Mara sat on the porch steps, staring out at the devastation. Cole came and sat beside her, the throbbing in his arm a dull, constant reminder of how close they had come to disaster. She spoke, her voice low. She said this was her fault. If not for the letter, if not for her presence, none of this would be happening. It was the guilt of a survivor, an irrational but powerful emotion. Cole looked at her. He said the fire was not her fault, and the letter was not her fault either. He told her it was the sin of the man who wrote it, not the woman who believed it. His words were simple, direct, and they lifted a weight from her she had not realized she was carrying. The next morning, Cole found her outside on the porch with a bucket of water and a rag. The steps were covered in a thick layer of fine, gray ash. He watched as she began to methodically wash it away, scrubbing each board clean, her movements deliberate and focused. It was a small act, but in the face of the vast, blackened landscape, it was an act of profound defiance, a refusal to be buried by the past, a commitment to making a clean space from which to start again. That afternoon, Jesse returned from a ride to the southern edge of their property, his expression grim. He had found tracks, not just cattle tracks, but 2 sets of shod horses. They had come close, under the cover of the smoke, and he had found something else, a discarded cigar, the expensive kind that Silas Vane was known to smoke. While he was there, hiding in a ravine, 2 of Vane's hired men had ridden by. They had not seen him. They were talking loudly, complaining about the heat and the failed fire. And Jesse had heard them mention it, a water contract with the railroad. They were boasting about how rich Vane was going to be once he got his hands on Hart's Hollow. The threat was no longer a matter of legal papers and social pressure. It had escalated. The fire had been no accident. It had been a deliberate attempt to burn him out. That night, their fears were confirmed. A single sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the hollow, the bullet thudding into the log wall of the cabin, just feet from the window. It was a warning, a clear, unambiguous message. Cole stood in the darkened cabin, the smell of gunpowder faint on the night air. He had been a fool to think he could wait this out. Vane was not going to play by any rules. The time for waiting for proof was over. It was time to force the issue, to take the evidence they had, scant as it was, and bring it before the law, whatever that was worth in Redemption Ridge. He found Mara on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the night's chill. The sky, scrubbed clean of smoke, was a vast canopy of brilliant, glittering stars. The silence was absolute. The terror of the day, the fire, the bullet, had stripped away all their pretenses, leaving only a raw, shared vulnerability. She began to speak, her voice barely a whisper. She told him the whole story then, not just the sanitized version she had offered before. She spoke of the man at the boarding house, of his escalating obsession, of the way his eyes followed her, of the night he had trapped her in the pantry. She described her flight, the fear of being hunted, of looking over her shoulder in every town, of seeing his face in every crowd. She had come west not just for a new life, but to disappear, to run so far that he could never find her. Cole listened, the silence of the starry night amplifying her quiet words. He felt a cold, protective anger rise within him, an anger that was far more potent than the fury he felt toward Silas Vane. When she finished, a single tear tracing a clean path through the soot still on her cheek. He did not offer empty platitudes or grand promises. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady in the starlight, and said the only thing that mattered. "Here, you are safe." Cole's promise, spoken into the vast, starry silence, was a foundation stone laid in the dark. It did not banish the threat, but it changed the nature of the ground on which they stood. They were no longer 2 strangers trapped by circumstance. They were partners in a siege, and the quiet of the ranch in the following days was not one of peace, but of strategy. The memory of the bullet embedded in the cabin wall was a constant, tangible reminder of their peril. The forged letter, once a symbol of Mara's misplaced hope, now became their primary tool, a puzzle to be taken apart piece by piece. They sat at the rough kitchen table, the oil lamp casting a circle of warm light, and examined it again. It was Mara, her eyes accustomed to the fine details of needlework. Who noticed it? She ran her finger along the central crease where the paper had been folded to fit in an envelope. She said that it felt awkward, wrong. Cole took the letter, his own calloused fingers less sensitive. He did not understand. She guided his hand, showing him how the paper had been folded inward from the left. Then the right flap brought over it, a sequence that felt unnatural to a right-handed person. But for someone who favored their left hand, it would be the most natural motion in the world. Dr. Nora's words came back to him with the force of a slammed door. Silas Vane was left-handed. It was another small, crucial piece, a testament to the culprit's own unconscious habits, a signature more damning than the forged name at the bottom of the page. That night, after a long day of reinforcing the corral fence, Cole felt Mara's eyes on him as he stood by the hearth. His gaze was fixed on the small, locked cedar box on the mantelpiece. The promise he had made to her that she was safe here felt hollow when he thought of his own failure to protect his brother. Daniel had trusted the law, trusted in the inherent goodness of people, and it had gotten him killed and his name slandered. Cole's subsequent retreat from the world had been a form of self-preservation, a refusal to trust in anything that could be so easily broken or corrupted. But Mara was not broken. She had trusted in a lie, yet her spirit remained intact. Her presence was a quiet challenge to his cynicism. He reached up, took the leather thong from around his neck, and selected the small key. With a quiet click, he unlocked the box. He lifted the lid and carried it to the table. He did not need to explain the significance of the act. She understood it was an offering of trust. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were the relics of his former life, a small, silver-framed daguerreotype of a young man and woman with honest, hopeful faces, his parents, his mother's thin gold wedding band, and a folded, yellowed pay voucher from the Pikes Peak Cattle Company, dated for the week of the rustling raid. He pushed the voucher across the table to her. He told her it was his brother Daniel's last pay. He had been 100 miles south, delivering a herd on the day the cattle were stolen from a neighboring ranch. This paper proved it. He had taken it to Sheriff Deeks a year ago, after Daniel's body was brought back and the whispers started. Deeks had glanced at it, dismissed it as irrelevant, and proceeded to close his investigation, naming Daniel Hart as a confederate of the thieves. It was easier than finding the real culprits. As Mara looked at the voucher, her expression a mixture of sorrow and anger on his behalf. Cole reached back into the box and pulled out one last item. It was a rolled sheet of canvas, tied with a leather strip. He untied it and spread it on the table. It was a map, hand-drawn with incredible care and detail. It showed Hart's Hollow, the creek, the fence lines, the location of the cabin and barn. But running through the entire property, marked in blue ink with notes on depth and flow rate, was a detailed rendering of the underground aquifer. Daniel had been the planner, the dreamer. He had spent a year studying geology, convinced that the hidden water source was the key to their future, the one thing that would allow them to survive the brutal droughts that periodically ravaged the territory. The map was his legacy, a testament to his hope. And now, it was a stark, undeniable illustration of Silas Vane's motive. This was not just about land. It was about the water that lay beneath it, a resource that would be worth a fortune to the coming railroad. The quiet understanding that passed between them in that moment was more profound than any spoken words. Mara was no longer just a victim he was protecting. She was the keeper of his family's deepest wound and its most precious secret, and in her clear, compassionate gaze, Cole felt the first true easing of a solitude that had encased his heart for 2 long years. He was learning to trust again, not in the flawed institutions of men, but in the steadfast character of a single person. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of Sheriff Deeks and 2 hastily deputized thugs from Vane's saloon. They rode into the hollow with an air of swaggering authority, reining in their horses and staying in the saddle, a clear posture of intimidation. Deeks unrolled a scroll of paper with a flourish. He announced, his voice booming with satisfaction, that he had a warrant to search the premises and to take one Mara Ellison into protective custody. The warrant, he declared, was issued on the charge that Cole Hart had abducted her and was holding her against her will. The accusation was so perverse, such a grotesque twisting of the truth, that for a moment Cole could only stare in disbelief. Silas Vane was not just a thief, he was an artist of corruption, using the very instruments of justice as his weapons. Deeks's grin was triumphant. He had Cole trapped. If Cole resisted, he would be an outlaw. If he surrendered Mara, she would be delivered directly into Vane's hands. It was Jesse who saved them. The young ranch hand had been in the barn, and he emerged, seemingly by accident, carrying a shotgun he had been cleaning. He did not point it at anyone, but its presence was a powerful deterrent to the sheriff's hired muscle. Cole, his voice dangerously level, told Deeks to get off his land. He said the warrant was a fraud, and he would not honor it. He informed the sheriff that any further correspondence could be directed to the circuit judge, whose arrival in Redemption Ridge was expected in 2 weeks. Deeks's face purpled with rage. He was not accustomed to being defied. He blustered and threatened, but faced with Cole's cold resolve and Jesse's silent shotgun, his courage failed him. He wheeled his horse around, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and promised that this was not over. As they rode away, the weight of their isolation pressed in on Cole. Vane had friends. He had the law on his side, and he was clearly willing to escalate. They, on the other hand, were alone, or so they thought. The next afternoon, a wagon rattled into the hollow. It was driven by Mr. O'Malley, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man with arms like tree limbs and a beard the color of rust. Dr. Nora Pike sat beside him on the wagon seat. O'Malley did not waste words. He said that he and some other townsfolk did not hold with the sheriff's brand of justice. He said a man's home was his castle, and he had brought them some supplies. He unloaded sacks of flour and coffee, a side of bacon, and a box of shotgun shells. Nora, meanwhile, brought news. Several of the other ranchers, men Cole had known his whole life, were spooked. They were afraid of Silas Vane, and more than that, they were afraid of the railroad. They would offer sympathy, but no help. The community was divided, fractured by fear and greed. But Nora had also brought a whisper of hope. She had spoken with one of the girls from the saloon, a young woman named Rosie, who was desperate to escape her life there. Rosie was terrified of Silas, but she hated him more than she feared him. And she had told Nora something vital. She had been in the back room the day Silas had received the packet of expensive paper from Tanner's Goods. She had seen him practicing a signature, and later, she had heard him reading the letter aloud to himself before sealing it in an envelope. He had read the name, clear as day, Cole Hart. It was the final piece they needed, a human witness to corroborate the physical evidence. But it also made their situation untenable. If Silas knew they were gathering evidence, he would act decisively. The warrant was just the first move. They could not stay at the ranch. It was a trap, an isolated location where they could easily be cornered. That evening, Cole made his decision. The law in Redemption Ridge was a sham, but he had not lost all faith in the idea of justice itself. The circuit court was their only chance, a federal authority that Deeks and Vane could not control. But to get there, they had to survive the next 2 weeks, and Mara, the key witness against Silas, had to be kept safe, somewhere beyond his reach. He explained his plan to her as they stood on the porch, the setting sun painting the scorched earth in hues of orange and rose. There was a mission on the far side of the valley, run by a woman known as Sister Agnes. It was a sanctuary, a place for women in trouble, a refuge that even a man like Silas Vane would not dare to violate openly. He told Mara that she had to go there, to wait for the trial. He and Jesse would stay, protect the ranch as best they could. Mara listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply shook her head. She said she was not leaving him. They had started this together, and they would see it through together. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unwavering loyalty. She would not be hidden away. She would stand with him. Her refusal, her simple declaration of solidarity, struck Cole with unexpected force. He had spent 2 years believing he was better off alone, that relying on anyone was a weakness. But this woman, who had every reason to run, was choosing to stay, to face the danger with him. And so the plan was amended. They would go together. They would abandon the ranch, their home, and seek sanctuary at the mission. It felt like a retreat, a surrender of their ground. But Cole knew it was a strategic necessity, a way to stay alive to fight another day. They would leave at first light, slipping away before Deeks or Vane knew they were gone. The hollow would be left to the wind and the ghosts, a temporary sacrifice for the chance at a final, lasting justice. The journey from Heart's Hollow was a silent, pre-dawn flight. They left the cabin standing like a lonely sentinel in the heart of the blackened valley, a place of embattled memories. Cole, Mara, and Jesse rode east, away from the rising sun, their shadows long and skeletal before them. They spoke little, the clop of their horses' hooves a rhythmic, lonely sound in the vast stillness. They were abandoning their home, ceding the ground to an unseen enemy, and the act felt like a defeat, a deep and bitter concession. They reached the mission late in the afternoon. It was not what Cole had expected. Perched on a wide, flat mesa, it was a collection of simple, sun-bleached adobe buildings, their thick walls offering a defense against the heat and the wind. A sturdy, high wall enclosed a large courtyard where a few chickens pecked in the dust and rows of hardy vegetables grew in raised beds. There was a sense of order here, of peace carved directly from the harsh landscape. The air smelled clean, of lye soap, baking bread, and the faint, sweet scent of desert herbs. A woman in the simple gray habit of a lay sister met them at the gate. She was tall and lean, her face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and compassion. Her eyes, clear and direct, held a deep and abiding calm. This was Sister Agnes. She greeted them not with surprise, but with a quiet acceptance, as if their arrival were the most natural thing in the world. Dr. Nora Pike had sent a rider ahead, and they were expected. She led them into the courtyard, the heavy wooden gate closing behind them with a solid, reassuring thud. For the first time in weeks, Cole felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Within these walls, the threat of Silas Vane seemed a distant thing, a vulgar noise that could not penetrate the profound, working silence of the place. Sister Agnes showed Mara to a small, clean room with a simple cot and a window that looked out over the endless expanse of the territory. She then showed Cole and Jesse to a bunkhouse near the stables, a place for visiting tradesmen and travelers seeking shelter. The rules were simple and unspoken. This was a place of safety and respect. That evening, the three of them sat in the communal dining hall, a long room with heavy wooden tables, and ate a simple meal of thick vegetable stew and dense, dark bread. The hall was filled with the quiet murmur of women's voices. They were a varied group, young and old, some with the haunted look of recent trauma, others with the quiet resilience of those who had found a new beginning. No one stared or asked questions. Here, a person's past was their own business, only their present safety mattered. Later, as a deep purple twilight settled over the mesa. Cole found Mara standing by the low wall of the courtyard, looking west toward the distant, jagged line of the mountains that hid their home. The air was cool and still. From a distant corner of the compound, someone was softly playing a banjo, the simple, melancholic notes drifting on the evening air. It was a sound of such profound, ordinary peace that it made the danger they faced seem all the more obscene. He stood beside her, not speaking, simply sharing the silence. The last week had been a crucible of fire and fear, stripping away everything but the essential. He looked at her profile in the fading light, at the determined set of her jaw and the strength in her eyes. The lie of the letter had brought her here, but it was a truth far deeper that now held her in this place, at his side. She turned to him, her expression clouded with a vulnerability he had never seen before. Her voice was so low he had to lean closer to hear it. She spoke of the promise he had made, the simple words that he would keep her safe. She said she believed him, but she wanted him to know, to understand, what that promise truly entailed. She spoke of the man back east, of the constant fear of being pursued, of being cornered. The experience had left a mark on her soul, a deep-seated terror of being trapped, of being claimed against her will. Her hands twisted the fabric of her simple dress. She looked down at the dusty ground, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with a shame and fear that was heartbreaking to witness. She finally looked up at him, her eyes glistening in the twilight. She stammered the words, forcing them out as if they were stones in her throat, virgin and shy. The confession hung in the quiet air between them. It was not an invitation, nor was it a rejection. It was a profound act of trust, a bearing of her deepest, most guarded wound. She was telling him that she was unbroken, but fragile. She was giving him the truth of her history, a truth that made a mockery of Silas Vane's public insults and the town's cruel suspicions. She was placing her future, her very self, in his hands. Cole felt a wave of fierce, protective tenderness wash over him, so potent it almost stole his breath. He saw in that moment the full scope of the cruelty she had endured, and the incredible courage it had taken for her to survive it and to stand here now, offering him this final, fragile truth. He reached out, not to touch her, but as a simple, grounding gesture. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, accepting her words, honoring the courage it took to say them. His voice, when he spoke, was a low and steady anchor in the quiet dusk. "Then I'll be gentle and yours for life." The words were a vow, spoken with the simple, unadorned sincerity of a man who did not make promises lightly. It was a pledge that went far beyond the immediate threat of Silas Vane. It was a promise to protect not just her body, but her spirit, to honor her past, and to build a future based on respect and healing, not possession. He saw the tension in her shoulders finally release. A weight she had carried for years suddenly lifted. Tears welled in her eyes and traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow. He stepped forward and gently pulled her into an embrace. It was not a gesture of passion, but of comfort and profound reassurance. He held her as she trembled, his hand stroking her hair, offering his strength as a shield. The simple contact was a confirmation of his vow, a silent promise that he would be her sanctuary. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures finding shelter in each other. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, when she finally pulled back, her eyes were clear. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. She asked him, her voice light with a hint of her old wit, if he made promises like that often. "First time," he answered, his own voice rough with emotion. "And the last?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a decisive gesture, she untied the simple, faded blue scarf from her hair. Before he could react, she took his left wrist, the one that bore the raw, healing burn from the fire, and gently tied the scarf around it. The soft fabric was a cool, gentle touch against his skin. It was not a ring, not a formal contract. It was a simple, rustic knot. A piece of herself tied to a piece of his pain. A quiet, unadorned pledge made under a sky full of stars. A cowboy's betrothal. Their moment of quiet promise was shattered by the sound of a horse being ridden hard, its hooves drumming against the packed earth outside the mission walls. The gate opened, and Jesse appeared, his horse lathered in sweat, his young face grim. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop. He had news. He had ridden a wide circle around the town, listening for any rumors. He had heard from a friendly liveryman that Silas Vane was not waiting for the circuit judge to arrive. He had hired a half-dozen men, hard cases from the mining camps, gunmen with no allegiance to the law. Their job was simple: to make sure Cole Hart and his witnesses never made it to the courthouse. They would be watching the road, waiting. The news landed like a physical blow, a harsh intrusion of the violent world they had tried to leave behind. Mara's hand instinctively went to the scarf on Cole's wrist. The sanctuary of the mission was only temporary. The threat was still out there, more deadly than ever. Cole felt a familiar, cold anger begin to rise within him, the old instinct to meet violence with violence, to handle this himself, outside the law that had already failed him once. It would be so easy to slip away, to use his knowledge of the land to hunt the hunters, to end this threat with his own two hands. But then he looked at Mara. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the steadfast trust. She was not asking him to be a gunman. She was asking him to be the man who had just promised to be hers for life. He had a choice. He could revert to the solitary, vengeful man he had been, or he could become the man she believed him to be, a man who fought for justice, not just revenge. He made his decision. He would not run, he would not hide, and he would not become a killer. They had the truth on their side, and they would see it delivered to the law, no matter the cost. He told Jesse to get some rest. He said they would face them, but they would do it his way. Mara stood beside him, her choice already made. She had spent a year of her life running. She would not run anymore. She would stand with him, face the gunmen, face the court, and reclaim her own honor. Her presence at his side was a silent, unshakable affirmation of his choice. Later that night, they stood before Sister Agnes in her small, simple office. The room was lit by a single candle, its flame dancing on the whitewashed adobe walls. Cole explained their decision. He told her they intended to face the men Vane had hired and to see the trial through. He then looked at Mara, and with a quiet gravity, he told Sister Agnes that once this was over, once the truth was known and their names were cleared, he intended to make Mara Ellison his wife. Sister Agnes looked from Cole's determined face to Mara's resolute one. She saw the scarf tied around his wrist. She saw the silent, powerful bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the fire. She did not offer blessings or congratulations, only a simple, profound nod of understanding. In the flickering candlelight of that small, safe room, a silent pact was sealed. They were no longer just a man and a woman fighting for their lives. They were a promise of a future they would have to ride through a gauntlet of violence to claim. The decision to leave the mission was a crossing of a final, invisible line. They were no longer reacting, they were advancing. They rode with the rising sun at their backs, three small figures moving across a vast and indifferent landscape. Cole led them, not on the main rutted track that led to Redemption Ridge, but on a winding, less traveled path through the broken country of the foothills. He knew this land, its every fold and crevice, and he used that knowledge now as a weapon, choosing a route that offered cover and defensible positions. But he also knew that their enemy was not a fool. Silas Vane would anticipate such a move. He would be waiting. The entrance to Box Elder Canyon was a narrow slit in a wall of red rock, a place where the earth had cracked open, leaving a deep, winding passage. It was a shortcut, a path that would save them hours, but it was also a perfect trap. The rock walls rose 100 feet on either side, sheer and unforgiving. The canyon floor was a jumble of fallen boulders and coarse sand, wide enough for only 2 riders abreast. Cole reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon above, searching for any sign of movement, any glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. He felt a profound, animal instinct of wrongness. The air was too still. The silence was too complete. Jesse drew up beside him, his young face tight, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Mara, just behind them, said nothing, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her reins. Cole made his decision. He told Jesse to stay with Mara, to keep back near the entrance. He was going to ride ahead, draw them out, before either of them could protest. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon, and a puff of dust exploded from a rock just inches from Cole's head. The ambush had been sprung. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the canyon rim. It was a well-planned attack, a deadly crossfire designed to pin them down and annihilate them. Pinned down was exactly what Cole did not intend to be. He yelled at Jesse to fall back, to get Mara out of the canyon, his voice a raw command that cut through the cacophony of the gunshots. Cole spurred his horse, not in retreat, but charging forward, deeper into the canyon. He was making himself the bigger target, drawing the focus of the gunman. Bullets whined past his ears, chipping stone from the canyon walls. He bent low over his horse's neck, firing his own pistol up at the muzzle flashes, not aiming to kill but to suppress, to keep their heads down. Behind him, Jesse understood the tactic. He grabbed the reins of Mara's horse and began pulling her back toward the relative safety of the open country, firing his rifle with his free hand to cover their retreat. They were a team, their actions born of a desperate, unspoken understanding. Protect Mara at all costs. But the gunmen were professionals. 2 of them, seeing the plan, began to work their way down a steep, rocky incline, hoping to cut off Jesse and Mara's escape. Cole saw the movement and wheeled his horse, putting himself directly in their path. The world narrowed to a terrifying funnel of noise and motion. And then the sky broke open. The change was so sudden, so violent, it felt like a biblical event. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned a bruised, greenish black. The temperature plummeted, and then the hail came. It was not rain, but a fusillade of ice, stones the size of acorns, and then marbles, that hammered down with a deafening roar. The world dissolved into a chaotic, stinging blur. The hail struck the rocks with the force of thrown gravel, pounded on the riders, and turned the canyon floor into a treacherous, shifting sea of white. Horses screamed and reared, maddened by the painful, relentless assault of the ice. Cole's horse stumbled, and he fought to keep it on its feet. The gunmen on the rim were silenced, driven to seek whatever cover they could find. One of the men scrambling down the incline was caught on an exposed ledge. His horse, struck by the hail, lost its footing on the suddenly slick rock and went down with a sickening cry, its legs scrambling for purchase. The man was thrown clear, and he slid down the scree slope, landing in a heap at the bottom of a narrow, deep arroyo that snaked through the canyon floor. At the same time, the sheer volume of the hail, channeled by the steep canyon walls, was creating another, even more terrifying phenomenon. The dry arroyo, which had been a dusty ditch moments before, was now a raging torrent, a flash flood. A wall of brown water, ice and debris, roared down the canyon. It caught the fallen gunman, tumbling him like a broken doll, and swept him away in its powerful, inexorable grip. In the space of 30 seconds, nature had intervened with a brutal, impartial violence that dwarfed the petty ambitions of men. The hailstorm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world that was battered, bruised, and eerily silent. The only sound the receding roar of the floodwater. In the chaos, as the remaining gunmen regrouped, Cole saw his chance. He charged toward Jesse and Mara, yelling for them to ride. To get out now. They spurred their horses, galloping out of the canyon's mouth and back into the open. The ground a carpet of melting ice, but they were not unscathed. As they cleared the last of the rocks, Jesse swayed in his saddle, his face ashen. A dark red stain was spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. High on his shoulder, a stray bullet, in the first moments of the ambush, had found its mark. They did not stop until they were miles away, hidden in a thick grove of cottonwoods. Jesse, trying to be stoic, finally slumped forward, and Cole had to catch him to keep him from falling. The wound was a deep, ragged furrow along the muscle of his shoulder, bleeding sluggishly. It was not fatal, but it needed to be cleaned and closed. As if in answer to a prayer, a wagon appeared on the track ahead of them. It was Dr. Nora Pike, on her way back to town from a call. She took one look at Jesse and her face became a mask of professional focus. There was no time to get him to her office. The work had to be done here. Her methods were as raw and practical as the land itself. She poured a liberal amount of whiskey from a flask directly into the wound. Ignoring Jesse's sharp, involuntary hiss of pain, she built a small, hot fire, while Mara tore strips from her petticoat for bandages. Nora heated the tip of a sewing needle in the flames until it glowed red, with a calm, steady hand. She began to stitch the wound closed, her movements quick and efficient. It was a brutal, thuddingly real procedure, a testament to the harsh necessities of frontier medicine. When she was finished, Jesse was pale and sweating, but the bleeding had stopped. Nora gave him a long drink of the whiskey and told Cole he needed to get him to town, to a real bed. The circuit judge had arrived a day early. She told them the trial was set to begin tomorrow morning. As they approached the outskirts of Redemption Ridge, their small, battered group was met by a new kind of assault. Sheriff Deeks, with Silas Vane standing smirking at his side, was waiting for them in the middle of the street. He pointed a fat finger at Mara, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd of onlookers to hear. He declared that there was the source of all the trouble, a common saloon girl, pretending to be a lady, who had lured an honest rancher into a gunfight. The lie was so blatant, so vicious, that the crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. But before Mara could even defend herself, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the air. Sister Agnes, having ridden in from the mission, stepped forward from the crowd. She fixed Deeks with a stare as hard as granite. She said she knew Mara Ellison. She said Mara had spent the last 2 weeks at her mission, where she had helped nurse the sick and had read stories to the orphaned children. She then held up a small, leather-bound book. It was a record of the mission's charitable works, and in it, she had documented Mara's selfless contributions. She challenged Deeks to call God's own work a lie. The sheriff, faced with the unshakable moral authority of Sister Agnes, was momentarily speechless. But the damage had been done. The seeds of doubt had been replanted. Cole looked at Jesse, pale and wounded. He looked at Mara, her face a mask of weary defiance as she was slandered in the street. He looked at Silas Vane's triumphant smirk, and something inside him snapped. The carefully constructed dam of patience and principle, the one he had been building since Mara's arrival, crumbled into dust. A white-hot rage, the same helpless fury he had felt when they brought his brother's body home, consumed him. He saw Daniel's face, heard the lies they had told about him. He was tired of fighting by the rules of a game that was rigged against him. A cold, deadly calm settled over him. He was going to kill Silas Vane. Right here, right now. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift, the sudden, lethal intent in the air. But a hand on his arm stopped him. It was Mara. She stood before him, her eyes pleading. She looked at his face, at the cold emptiness that had replaced the man she knew. Her voice was quiet, but it carried with an undeniable force. "I need an honest husband. Cole, not a cold gunman." Her words were like a bucket of ice water, shocking him back from the precipice. She was not just speaking of her own need. She was reminding him of his promise, of the man he had vowed to be for her. He looked from her face to Silas's, and the choice was clear. Justice, not vengeance. He slowly, deliberately, took his hand away from his gun. At that moment, a figure darted out from the alley beside the saloon. It was Rosie, the young woman who worked for Silas. She was terrified, her eyes wide, but she ran directly to Dr. Nora and shoved a thick-skinned leather-bound ledger into her hands. She whispered a single, frantic word. "Everything." Then she turned and disappeared back into the shadows. Nora opened the ledger. Her eyes scanned the pages of neat, left-handed script. It was all there. A detailed accounting of Vane's criminal enterprises, and on one page, a series of entries that made her breath catch. An itemized list. 1 packet of linen paper and ink from Tanner's Goods. A generous tip for information regarding Cole Hart's mail. A payment for a forged postal seal. And a final, damning entry, a substantial monthly retainer, paid in cash, to Sheriff Deeks. Nora looked up, a grim, triumphant light in her eyes. She held up the book. They had him. They had it all. The crowd began to disperse, the street theater over for the day. Deeks and Vane, seeing the ledger, exchanged a look of cold fury and retreated into the saloon. Cole, with O'Malley the blacksmith's help, got Jesse to Dr. Nora's small infirmary. As they laid him down on a cot, Cole looked at his own wrist. The blue scarf Mara had tied there was stained with mud and streaked with rain from the hailstorm. The knot was still tight, the promise still held, having endured the trial of both the canyon and his own soul. They had survived. They had the evidence, but the clock was ticking. From the town square, the sound of a hammer banging could be heard. They were setting up the makeshift courtroom in the church. The trial, and their final stand, was only hours away. The church was not a house of God that morning. It was a crucible. The simple wooden pews, usually reserved for hymns and sermons, were packed with the entire population of Redemption Ridge. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a tense, murmuring sea of humanity, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and quiet judgment. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the tall, plain glass windows, illuminating the makeshift courtroom. A heavy oak table had been placed at the front, before the altar, to serve as the judge's bench. Judge Isaac Thorne sat there, a man in his 60s with a mane of white hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from the granite of the surrounding mountains. His eyes, deep-set and weary, missed nothing. He was a traveling circuit judge, a man who carried the full weight and authority of federal law in his saddlebags. And he had an almost legendary reputation for being immune to intimidation and local politics. At a small table to the right sat Cole and Mara, with Dr. Nora Pike and the formidable blacksmith, O'Malley. Seated directly behind them as a silent wall of support, Mara was pale but composed, her hands folded in her lap. Cole sat ramrod straight, his gaze fixed forward, the blue scarf tied around his wrist a stark and personal banner of the promises he intended to keep. At the opposing table, Silas Vane lounged in his chair, dressed in his customary fine suit, a look of amused contempt on his face. Beside him, Sheriff Deeks sat puffed up with an air of self-importance, his badge gleaming on his chest. They looked utterly confident, two predators in their natural habitat, convinced of their ultimate victory. Judge Thorne banged a small wooden gavel, the sharp sound cutting through the nervous whispers. The proceedings began. The charge, as read out by a clerk, was the one sworn by Sheriff Deeks that Cole Hart had abducted and unlawfully detained Mara Ellison. The judge called Mara to the stand first. In a quiet, clear voice that carried to every corner of the church, she told her story. She spoke of the letter, of her arrival, of Cole's shock and his insistence that it was a forgery. She spoke of the storm that had trapped them, and of the respect and honor he had shown her throughout. When she finished, Silas Vane's lawyer, a slick man from Denver, rose to question her. His voice was oily, his questions dripping with insinuation. He painted her as a woman of loose morals, a desperate adventuress who had concocted the story of the letter to entrap a lonely rancher. The townspeople shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement with the ugly picture he was painting. But Cole's lawyer, a young, earnest man Nora had hired, was ready. He began to build their case, not with rhetoric, but with a chain of simple, undeniable facts. He called Martha Tanner to the stand, the storekeeper, her face set in a frown of deep disapproval at the proceedings, testified that a well-dressed, left-handed man who smelled of cheap floral water had purchased the exact paper on which the letter was written. Next came Dr. Nora Pike. She testified about the ink stain she had seen on Silas Vane's cuff and of her professional opinion, as one who had sutured his arm, that he was indeed left-handed. The murmur in the church grew louder. The chain of logic was beginning to form, link by damning link. Then the church doors opened, and Rosie, the girl from the saloon, was escorted in by O'Malley. She was terrified, her eyes darting nervously toward Silas Vane, who fixed her with a look of pure venom. But she took the stand, and prompted by the young lawyer, she told her story. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She told the court that she had seen Silas practicing Cole's signature. She told them she had heard him read the contents of the letter aloud to himself, including the name, Cole Hart. The moment she finished, Silas Vane's lawyer was on his feet, shouting that the word of a common saloon girl was worthless. But the damage was done. The final link in the chain had been forged. And then came the ledger. Dr. Nora Pike was recalled to the stand, and she presented the thick, leather-bound book. She explained, in her clear, precise voice, the contents of the pages that detailed the payments for the paper, the seal, and the monthly bribes to Sheriff Deeks. A collective gasp went through the church. All eyes turned to the sheriff, whose florid face had gone a pasty white. Silas Vane's mask of calm superiority finally cracked. For the first time, a flicker of pure, animal panic showed in his eyes. It was at that precise moment, as the weight of the evidence settled like a shroud over Vane and Deeks, that the law was met with lawlessness. A gunshot cracked from the town square outside, shattering one of the church windows. Glass exploded inward. A woman screamed. Chaos erupted. People scrambled from the pews, trying to dive for cover. Silas Vane used the confusion to his advantage. He overturned his table and drew a small, concealed pistol from his coat. The battle for justice was no longer one of words. It had become a battle of bullets. Vane's hired guns, the men from the canyon, began firing from the street, their bullets thudding into the wooden walls of the church, their shouts a savage counterpoint to the screams within. Cole reacted instantly. His first thought was not of fighting, but of protecting. He shoved Mara down behind the judge's heavy oak table, yelling at her to stay down. He saw O'Malley, the massive blacksmith, already moving toward the main doors. Cole shouted at him to bar them, to seal them off. Then, drawing his own pistol, he moved to the broken window. He was not a killer. He was a protector. Mara's words echoed in his mind. An honest husband. He did not aim for the men in the street. He aimed for their weapons. His first shot was a marvel of disciplined skill, striking the pistol from the hand of a man who was taking aim at the door. The man howled in pain and surprise, clutching his shattered hand. A second shot kicked up dust at the feet of another gunman, forcing him to scramble for cover. Cole was establishing a line of defense, buying time, protecting the innocent people trapped inside. As the gunfight raged, The sky outside turned from a bright, dusty blue to a dark, angry purple. A sudden violent wind rattled the church, and a low roll of thunder rumbled in the distance, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The temperature dropped. A full-blown thunderstorm was descending upon the town with the speed and fury of an avenging angel. Silas Vane, seeing his hired help faltering, took his own shot, aiming not at Cole, but at Rosie, who was cowering behind a pew. But before he could fire, a figure moved to intercept him. O'Malley, having barred the door, charged across the church, a human battering ram. Vane's bullet went wide, splintering the altar. O'Malley's massive fist connected with Vane's jaw, sending him sprawling. At that exact moment, a blinding fork of lightning split the sky, followed instantaneously by a clap of thunder so loud, so concussive, that the entire church shook. The lightning bolt struck the top of the bell tower with an explosive crack. The great iron bell, which had hung silent for years except on Sundays, began to ring, not in a steady peal, but in a wild, discordant, deafening clang, as if the tower itself were screaming in agony. The heavens opened. Rain fell in a solid driving sheet, a torrential downpour that turned the dusty street into a river of mud in seconds. The gunmen outside, battered by the rain and spooked by the apocalyptic sound of the bell, scattered and fled. Inside the church, the chaos reached its peak. The bell tolled its mad, rhythmic clang above them. Silas Vane, recovering from O'Malley's blow, scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of insane rage. He saw Cole, silhouetted against the broken window. This was his last chance. He raised his pistol, but Cole was faster. He fired once. His bullet struck the pistol in Vane's hand, sending it spinning into the shadows. Vane cried out, clutching his hand. Cole was on him in 2 strides. He did not draw his gun again. He remembered his promise. He remembered Mara. His fist, hard as iron from years of ranch work, struck Vane squarely on the jaw. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap, unconscious. The fight was over. Judge Thorne, who had taken cover behind his bench with the calm dignity of a man who had seen everything the West had to throw at him, rose to his feet. His voice boomed over the ringing of the bell. He pointed a finger, not at Vane, but at Sheriff Deeks, who was trying to shrink into the shadows. He declared him a disgrace to the law, a party to conspiracy and attempted murder on the authority of the United States government. He stripped him of his office, here and now. He ordered O'Malley to take his badge and place him under arrest. The judge then looked at Mara, who was rising from behind the table. His stern expression softened. He spoke, his voice carrying with it the full weight of the law. He said that the court recognized her extraordinary courage and her unimpeachable character. He declared that any slander against her name would be considered contempt of this court and would be dealt with severely. He had not only cleared her name, he had shielded it with the power of the law itself. Slowly, as if its rage were finally spent, the wild clanging of the bell from the tower began to slow. It rang a few more times, each peal more mournful than the last, and then fell silent. The only sounds were the steady, heavy drumming of the rain on the roof and the collective, shuddering sigh of relief that seemed to pass through every person in the church. The tension, which had been stretched to a breaking point, finally snapped, replaced by a stunned, exhausted quiet. The rain was washing the dust and the blood from the streets of Redemption Ridge, a baptism for a town that had nearly lost its soul. Judge Thorne pointed at the unconscious Silas Vane and the now badgeless, trembling Deeks. He ordered them bound and held for transport to the federal prison in Denver. As O'Malley and several other deputized townsmen hauled the 2 men to their feet, the people of the town watched, their expressions no longer filled with suspicion or fear, but with a dawning, reluctant respect. They looked at Cole, not as a reclusive outcast, but as a man who had stood for them. They looked at Mara, not as a fallen woman, but as the catalyst for a cleansing they had all desperately needed. The view from the pews of the Redemption Ridge Church had been irrevocably changed. The ride back to Hearts Hollow was a pilgrimage through a transformed world. The torrential rain that had cleansed the town of its immediate sins had also blessed the land. The air, scrubbed clean of smoke and dust, smelled of wet earth and sage, a scent of pure, unadulterated life. As they crested the final ridge and looked down into their valley, the sight that greeted them was one of stark and beautiful resurrection. The fire had left a vast canvas of black, but the relentless downpour had turned the ash into a rich, dark mud. And already, piercing through the blackness, were 1,000 tiny pinpricks of impossible green. New life, tenacious and determined, was pushing its way toward the sun. The arroyo, which had been a dry, cracked wound for weeks, now gurgled with a steady stream of brown, life-giving water. The parched land was drinking its fill, and a quiet, powerful sense of renewal hung in the air. The ranch was not just surviving, it was being reborn. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself, one of peace and quiet, diligent work. The return to the routine of ranch life was a healing balm. Cole and a recovering Jesse rode the fence lines, not with the grim tension of men under siege, but with the satisfaction of builders restoring their home. Mara, in turn, reclaimed the cabin, her presence a source of quiet warmth and order. The calf, Patches, was now a sturdy, boisterous creature, a constant, living symbol of their shared victory over the fire. The changes were not confined to the valley. The shock waves from the trial had fundamentally altered the social landscape of Redemption Ridge. On their first trip into town for supplies, the difference was palpable. As Cole was loading sacks of grain into his wagon, Mr. O'Malley approached, wiping his massive, soot-stained hands on his leather apron. He did not offer words of praise or long speeches. He simply extended his hand. Cole took it, and the blacksmith's grip was as firm and unyielding as the iron he worked. It was a handshake of profound respect, an acknowledgement that passed between two men who understood the value of standing one's ground. For Mara, the change was even more profound. As she stepped out of Tanner's goods, a small group of the town's women, the same women who had once stared at her with cold suspicion, approached her on the boardwalk. Their leader, the wife of the local minister, had a look of genuine contrition on her face. She apologized. She said they had been wrong to judge her, that they had allowed fear and gossip to blind them to her true character. It was a simple, heartfelt admission, and it was echoed by the other women, for Mara, who had spent so much of her life being invisible or scorned. This public acceptance was a gift more precious than gold. It was the restoration of her honor, freely and publicly given. They also learned that Sister Agnes, true to her word, had taken Rosie under her wing at the mission. The young woman was safe, learning to sew and read, finally free from the shadow of Silas Vane. The community, in its own halting way, was beginning to heal its own wounds, to care for its most vulnerable. Back at the ranch, Jesse's recovery was swift, buoyed by youth and Mara's good cooking. His arm, neatly stitched by Dr. Nora, was healing well, though he complained mightily about the indignity of having to perform his chores one-handed. One warm afternoon, as he was grumbling about the dust and the sweat, Cole and Mara exchanged a look. Cole declared that what Jesse needed was a proper cleansing, a baptism to wash away his sins of complaint. Before the young man could protest, Cole grabbed him by the belt and, with a great heave, unceremoniously dumped him into the full horse trough. The splash was immense, and Jesse came up sputtering, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his head, his face a picture of pure, comical outrage. Mara, who had been holding a bar of lye soap, tossed it to him, telling him he might as well make good use of the opportunity. The sound that followed was one that had been absent from Hearts Hollow for far too long, the sound of genuine, unrestrained laughter, echoing in the clear afternoon air. It was the sound of a family being born. In these quiet, healing days, the growth in each of them became clear. Mara, no longer the hunted, moved with a new confidence, her quiet strength now matched by an easy grace. She had found not just a sanctuary, but a home, a place where her worth was recognized and her voice was heard. Cole, in turn, was a man transformed. The hard shell of his cynicism had been irrevocably cracked. He had put his faith in another person and had not been failed. He had risked everything on the integrity of the law and in the form of Judge Thorne. The law had proven itself worthy. The deep-seated bitterness that had poisoned his soul since his brother's death was beginning to recede. One morning, before riding into town, he went to the small cedar box. He took out the yellowed pay voucher and the hand-drawn map of the aquifer. He wrapped them carefully in oilcloth and placed them in his saddlebag. He found Judge Thorne at the hotel, preparing to leave town. Cole presented the evidence, not with the anger of a man demanding vengeance, but with the quiet dignity of a man seeking justice. He told the judge the story of his brother, Daniel, and of Sheriff Deeks's deliberate refusal to consider the proof of his innocence. Judge Thorne listened intently, his wise old eyes studying Cole's face. He took the documents and promised he would open a federal inquiry into the matter. For the first time, Cole felt that the stain on his family's name might one day be washed clean. He had learned to trust again, to fight for the past not with a gun, but with the truth. That afternoon, while Cole was mending a harness in the barn, he saw Mara by the fence line behind the cabin. She had taken the faded blue scarf from his wrist. In a basin of clean, soapy water, she was gently washing it, her hands moving with a tender care. The mud and rain of the canyon, the grime of the fight, all of it dissolved into the water, leaving the fabric a clean, clear blue once more. She wrung it out and hung it carefully over the top rail of the fence, a small, bright flag of promise fluttering in the gentle breeze. Their vow, having passed through its trial by fire and water, was now whole and clean. Life settled into a rhythm of shared work and easy companionship. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of solitude, but of comfortable intimacy. It was a silence now frequently punctuated by the small, ordinary sounds of a shared life. They counted the new calves together, their voices a quiet litany of hope for the future. They argued, with a playful seriousness, over the proper strength of morning coffee. His always too strong for her, hers always too weak for him. Laughter became the new, most common sound in the house that had once known only echoes. The town, too, continued its own path of reform. With Judge Thorne's oversight, they held a special election. O'Malley, the blacksmith, was overwhelmingly elected as the new town sheriff, a man whose honesty was as solid as the anvils he worked on. One of his first acts, with the town council's approval, was to draft a new ordinance, offering legal protection and aid to any unescorted woman arriving in the territory, ensuring that what had happened to Mara would never happen again. One evening, as the first green harvest of hay was being brought in from the high meadows, Cole and Mara stood on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The land before them was a patchwork of black and vibrant green, a landscape that bore the scars of its past but was now defined by the promise of its future. They had a home. They had a community. They had each other. Cole turned to her, the fading light catching the quiet strength in her eyes. He said the first cutting of hay was in, and the new grass was growing strong. It was time. He asked her if she would marry him. Mara's smile was as bright and as full of promise as the valley before them. She simply nodded, and they agreed on a day. They would be married at the end of the summer, after the first full harvest, a celebration of the life they had fought for and the future they would now build, together. The day of the wedding arrived with the gentle, golden breath of late summer. The harvest was in, the hay was stacked high in the barn, and the land, scarred but healing, wore a mantle of deep green and gold. The ceremony was not to be held within the church walls, but out in the open, in a wide meadow overlooking the valley, the place where the new grass had grown thickest, and the wild columbine still bloomed in stubborn, beautiful patches. The community of Redemption Ridge came, not as suspicious onlookers, but as willing participants in a celebration they felt they had earned a small piece of. They arrived in wagons and on horseback, their faces scrubbed clean, their Sunday best a little worn but proudly displayed. They had brought with them gifts of food and drink, turning the occasion into a potluck feast, a communal offering of peace. There was no formal altar. In its place stood one of Cole's old saddles, polished to a deep, rich sheen, its worn leather telling a story of hard work and perseverance. It rested on a simple wooden trestle, a perfect, unpretentious symbol of the life they were choosing. Mara carried no expensive bouquet, but a simple, hand-tied gathering of wild blue columbine and fragrant purple thyme, flowers she had picked herself from the hillsides of her new home. The town's new minister, a kind-faced man with a quiet voice, officiated. He spoke not of scripture, but of resilience, of the way the land and the people on it could endure fire and drought and emerge stronger. He spoke of truth as a cleansing rain. As he spoke, a soft, distant sound drifted on the breeze from the town below. Sheriff O'Malley, at the community's request, was ringing the church bell. It was not a loud, commanding peal. The sound was softer now, slightly imperfect due to the crack left by the lightning strike. It was a gentle, humble ringing, the sound of a community that was scarred but whole, its voice no longer perfect, but honest and true. When it came time for the vows, the minister stepped back, allowing for the words that mattered most. Cole and Mara turned to face each other. The entire valley, the entire community, seemed to fade into a respectful silence, leaving only the two of them standing under the vast blue sky. Mara looked into Cole's eyes, her own shining with a light that banished all the old shadows. She reached out and gently touched the faded blue scarf that was once again tied around his wrist. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft murmur, meant for him alone. Yet it seemed to carry the weight of their entire journey. She whispered, a smile touching her lips, a memory and a release in a single breath. I was once virgin and shy. Cole's gaze softened. He covered her hand with his own, his touch firm and reassuring, the promise he had made in the twilight of the mission. A vow spoken in desperation and hope was now a truth forged in fire and faith. He answered her whisper with his own, his voice low and steady, a bedrock of certainty. And I told you I would be gentle and that I would be yours for life. He leaned in and kissed her, a simple, honest kiss that sealed the promise, locking their past and their future together in a single, perfect moment. The crowd erupted in a cheer, a genuine, heartfelt roar of approval that echoed across the valley. The celebration that followed was a joyous, simple affair. Laughter, a sound once so foreign to the Hollow, was now its most abundant crop. Dr. Nora Pike, her eyes twinkling, declared herself the official godmother to any and all future Hart children, a pronouncement that made Mara blush and Cole grin. Jesse, his arm now fully healed, was no longer just a ranch hand. Cole had drawn up papers with the lawyer, making him a junior partner in the ranch, his loyalty and courage rewarded with a share of the future he had helped secure. He spent the afternoon charming the blacksmith's daughter, his young face alight with a future of his own. And near the food tables, helping to serve the stew, was Rosie. She was living and working at the mission, her skills in the kitchen now used to nourish rather than to entertain. She was saving her money, she told Mara, and was learning to be a seamstress, her hands now creating rather than just serving. A new life, stitched together with honest thread. The core message of their struggle had taken root not just in their own lives, but in the community. That love, when paired with courage, could heal the deepest wounds of solitude. That dignity was not a thing to be given or taken away by others, but a fire to be tended within one's own soul. And that justice, though sometimes a distant and difficult peak to climb, was a destination worth the journey. Later, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long, peaceful shadows across the meadow, Cole and Mara found a quiet moment to themselves. They stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out not at the past, but at the future. In the far distance, a thin, straight line was being carved into the landscape, the undeniable path of the coming railroad. It was no longer a symbol of dread, but one of reality, of a changing world that they would have to meet. Cole spoke of the future, not with the anxiety of a man who feared change, but with the quiet confidence of a planner. The railroad would need water, a great deal of it, and their land, thanks to Daniel's foresight, held the most reliable source in the territory. They would not be victims of progress. They would be partners in it. He showed her the plans he had begun to draw up for a legally registered water station, a business that would serve the new arrivals and secure the ranch for generations to come. It was a practical, shared dream, built upon the foundation of his brother's legacy and their own hard-won resilience. As the sun finally dipped below the peaks, it ignited the sky in a blaze of orange and purple. The cattle, grazing peacefully in the valley below, began their slow walk back toward the barn, their movement kicking up a fine, golden dust that hung in the evening air like a benediction. Cole stood behind Mara, his arms wrapped around her, his one hand held hers, their fingers intertwined. His other hand rested on his own wrist, his thumb gently stroking the soft, worn fabric of the blue scarf. Their promise, their past, their future, all held in a simple, quiet touch. The final guests departed, their wagons rattling away into the twilight, leaving behind the happy echoes of a day well spent. The sound of the cracked bell had long since faded, replaced by the gentle chirp of crickets and the soft whisper of the wind through the new grass. A lie had brought them together in a storm of dust and fear, but a series of honest, courageous choices had led them here, to this profound and simple peace. A crooked beginning had found a straight and true path. Cole opened the cabin door, and a warm, welcoming light spilled out onto the porch. He led Mara inside. The door swung shut, not on a lonely, silent space, but on the sound of soft, shared laughter, the sound of a house that had finally, truly, become a home. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where in the world you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.